Welcome to this Halloween special episode of The Adventures of Alice and Bob, the podcast where we talk to the people behind the keyboards in cybersecurity to find out what motivates them, keeps them up at night, and what they've learned in dealing with real-world threats. For this Halloween special, we've managed the truly terrifying feat of coordinating all three co-hosts' diaries and getting a slot with us all together, so hopefully we'll be able to shine some light amongst the fear, uncertainty, and doubt that abounds within the industry. So welcome to my co-host, the mysterious Mark Mayfrey, and the crypt-kicking Carl Langford. Welcome, guys.
What's up, dude? And it is magical that we're all three here. It's like Tetris, trying to get it to line up perfectly, but it worked. Indeed.
So why don't we kick off this session, this discussion, with what spooked you in the world of cyber recently? Carl.
And if phishing's the scary thing for Halloween, then the gift of Christmas or whatever holiday gift that you might be into should be FIDO2 for organizations. So you can get beyond the worrying about hoping that people are going to know what links to click on. I always find it like it's a funny proposition that, like, you know, most of us that like do security for a living, like anybody that thinks you're not accidentally going to click on a link or get it wrong once or so on and so forth, right? Like it's going to happen. And so it's how do you adopt technologies like FIDO2 and other things that are just much more resistant, if you will, than even your push 2FA and things of that nature. So, but yeah, it's crazy. That's one that's been something for a very long time coming, and there's still it's easy to say like go do FIDO2, but it's still very hard in practice. There's so many apps and things that don't work right. I won't name any specific vendors that are embedding like ancient versions of Chrome and things that don't support it. But anyways, what would be my scary thing? It might be that. Chrome as universal desktop app. That might be one of the many scary things out there. Now, I think it's always interesting when I think of there was just some new vulns I was looking at yesterday, and there's always like the push to make like software better, more secure, and so on. But there's also this like humbling realization that like you only need so many critical vulns to come out a year that are enough to impact most companies, right? Like a lot of times you see all these like rankings, especially towards the end of the year, they'll be like, have vulnerabilities become more or less and so on. But, I've often thought it's like, what do you really need? Like one or two good vulns a month as kind of the beachhead of sorts of kind of getting into places if your phishing's not working for you. And so that's always one of those scary things of like there's always going to be this kind of constant trickle, like no matter how well we do at things, no matter how much we improve kind of software security. And that's not the reason you shouldn't, right? You should always make things like as hard a target as you can. But it is just that continued like realization and acceptance that like there's always going to be a vuln, there's always going to be a way, there's always going to be that misclick. And so, everything comes back to, again, just assuming breach or how do you make sure to have things that are that much more resilient, when you think in terms of auth and stuff like that. So I don't know if that's like a scary thing. Maybe that's like an old guy in security too long scary thing, than the right now immediate. What about for you, James?
Well, maybe the scary thing is how long you've been having to say the same thing, and that's still an issue, isn't it? I was talking at a conference last week, and one of the things we're talking with the audience about was we're talking about all these issues around, this has default credentials, or this, is an easily guessed password, and then you can get in and you have overprivileged access. And then we look back to like the Morris worm of 1988, and we go, yeah, that's exactly the same thing. With these core concepts in security, these sort of timeless concepts that you talk about, Mark, that are often, it feels like we're not learning the lesson. We're just calling it IoT devices now and complaining that they're unpatched and exposed and have default credentials rather than, your web server in the 1980s that you're trying to get going and all that kind of thing.
Yeah, no, it's totally true, man. We still have so much of a focus on teaching, tools, and I think even to maybe some worse extent, right? Where so many folks, they know the different products that they know as like their kind of security defenses, but getting into the kind of like the physics, being able to think deep in terms of like attack surface, and like just to your point, like those kind of timeless things. um it always feels like a quest to try to educate more on that. I always often joke, my wife now of many many years, who will happily explain attack surface to anybody, and it's because she's heard me talk about it so much. But it feels like you can't kind of explain that enough, and I think more importantly, there's always like that new crop of people kind of coming in the infosec, right? And it's like, are they getting those concepts as a thing that they're first learning, or is it just more like, here's the tools, here's how to navigate them, kind of missing those physics lessons. So I think until we get better at that kind of those fundamentals and teaching the fundamentals in a more consistent way out there, then we shall be doing many more name your latest scary thing.
That's actually my scary thing, I think, at the moment. To actually answer the question you asked me a few minutes ago, is actually the next generation and the learning. So I'm quite into like playing around with electronics and home automation and hardware hacking things. And the more and more I look online, and you find like the Instructables tutorials to how to set your Raspberry Pi up as like a home server and all this kind of thing. And then you see people go, oh, and you just do this, and there's no mention of like patching, updating, securing, and then you open these ports up and then you can connect to it anywhere in the world. And there's so many of these tutorials and advice that people just like follow through the scripts, not understanding the consequences of what they're doing, and opening up access and setting up something that might just sit in a cupboard for 5-10 years to come, doing some turning your light on and off remotely. That
Is that where you put yours, in the
a whole
cupboard?
level. Exactly, yeah, in the cupboard, yeah, airing cupboard. But no, this is the problem, right? That there's a lot of these tutorials, and people are getting upskilled on how to write Python script and do these things and connect things up and stick all the Lego together. But there's no actual kind of underlying security. There's no one looking at that saying, flagging, this is a high risk tutorial because it's going to tell you to do something stupid or put credentials in a script on the internet that anyone can access. So I think that's kind of the thing that's scaring me.
Yeah, for sure, man. And it's interesting because kind of to your point, I actually saw, and I wish I could remember who it was to give him a shout out, but I saw an interesting thread on Twitter the other day, and it was kind of making the joke of, for some high level web development, they were being sarcastic of like, shame on those folks that they don't know everything all the way down to the TCP/IP stack and so forth or whatever. And they were making the argument that like I think in most cases, right, where it's like the level of abstraction is also like extremely helpful for like progress and building and going. And so you can't expect everybody to know kind of like the full stack of things. And I don't know who honestly does know the full stack of anything at this point. And there's that kind of interesting trajectory of security, right, where it's like when things started out, you could kind of be a master of a lot of different domain areas. And I think in a way like most sciences, right, where it's like everything's gotten like very like specialized, and so you have to kind of pick your specialty. But it seems like if we were to kind of overlay it, there's and who knows, maybe this tracks with science in general, but now I'm getting way outside my depth. But it seems like there's a lot less people kind of focused on that like physics layer, if you will, right? And again, that's maybe that tracks with other fields, right? But feels like we need more of that to be able to make more of the fundamental changes and fundamental kind of understanding out there. But yeah.
Absolutely. And I think a good point to pick up on, Mark mentioned earlier, the MFA issues and the need for FIDO2. So one of the things that keeps cropping up in some of the breach stories we're seeing in 2022, and obviously causing people some concerns, are these attack techniques that are happening where, be it some teenager in a bedroom or some nation state where we're seeing credentials compromised. We're then seeing some form of MFA fatigue, whether it's just dumb, just annoy the user until they press something, or combined with a level of social engineering, pretending to be the help desk, WhatsApp messages, all this kind of thing. And then they get in, and then suddenly, all hell breaks loose in the environment because this identity, sometimes a contractor, third party, even not directly a member of the organization, has access to things. They've got this identity. They've managed to get past the gate of MFA, and then we see all these challenges break out. So maybe, Mark, you could talk us through why these things happen and what some of the problems are there.
Oh man, where to begin on that one? I literally don't know where to begin on,
Okay.
on that one.
Carl, would you like to talk us through some of these
Carl,
challenges?
Kick us off. I'm probably boring here in a sense of, I go back to FIDO2 of the challenge is like there's still a lot of hoops you got to jump through rolling out FIDO2, right? But like really getting focused on it. I mean, to me, it's hard to think that that's not like the one of the kind of top 10 projects that or even less than that, depending on where you're at with security, of like something you should be doing, right? And like especially these days where there's a greater chance, especially if you're um uh have more modern devices, right, where you have Windows Hello that can do FIDO2 in a variety of devices, laptops, and so on. You have you know Touch ID built into Macs for doing FIDO2, and then of course you can always have your UB keys and related. And there's uh I think there's something really cool there where not only are you getting, better, phishing resistant security, but the experience can just be better, right? Like just tapping your device that's sitting right in front of you, and being good to go, and never getting prompted because there are no prompts is nice. And also it kind of gives you mechanisms where I think sometimes with some of the kind of 2FA settings and kind of what you were saying, Carl, which I think is spot on, of like the kind of ongoing continuous authentication. And there's some cool research coming out of Microsoft, and we'll see what kind of standards happen there. But the that the kind of continuous authentication, it reminds me of some of the 2FA stuff of how we used to have a lot of crazy notions related to passwords of like, your passwords need to be, um, more complex than you're ever gonna remember. You need to be changing them like every month or you know what I mean? Like all these like crazy standards. I think a lot of those have shifted. And so kind of similar when you think of like FIDO2 and stuff. It's like, how often do you need to reauth, that person that's actually, on their same laptop versus a new device? Obviously, you'd want to be doing things differently. And so I think there's like different standards where you can make like that, uh, I don't want to hand wave the complexity of the projects, right? Because anybody who's had to do this stuff knows there's a lot, but you can make this amazing, like, roll up in the morning, showing up to work, do your touch ID, once or twice, depending on your systems. Maybe you have some apps that you've set to kind of a higher security level where you're having the reauth to them. You can kind of get more granular there, but generally it creates this, uh, tap your touch ID, tap your YubiKey, get your workday in, and it's seamless and more secure all together, right? So it's always hard to find those things in security where you can create like a better user experience while at the same time like increasing security, right? And it reminds me of my time at a company I won't name, but you can maybe guess. But um, there was there was an interesting thing I had learned of when a company like well, I'm actually wearing the hat today with a company like Tesla, right? Where it's not just about like making an electric car, but how do you just make a better car, right? And like the ability is there based on just the differences of like the simplicity, if you will, of an electric car and the maintenance and so on and so forth, right? And so FIDO2 reminds me of one of those things where there's still all sorts of problems with it. Again, so I don't get flamed online. Um, but the potential is there, right? If the maturity in the industry, and so we even look for our own company, right? Of it's something as CTO where I'm making sure like what are all the interactions that our own products have with auth? Are we making it as seamless and easy to use FIDO2 and other standards as possible? And those are really important things because not only just customer adoption, but we want more people to do these things, right? So we need to do our part as other companies in technology space need to do, right, to make those technologies work and be easier to use. So.
And for the benefit of the audience, if they're not familiar with FIDO2 and these more sort of unfishable MFA mechanisms, do you want to just briefly describe why it's different from these push notifications that people are seeing and having challenges with?
Yeah, I mean, Carl was mentioning of like, there's a few things when you think of push. I mean, obviously, people have a lot of different debates on MFA in general, but I think some MFA is better than none. Some people argue otherwise, because technically, when you think from a phishing perspective, right, you very much can trick somebody into authing, tapping their phone, and they're none the wiser, if you will. Happens more frequently. It's always been like a potential, but it's definitely happening a lot more frequently these days. And what's cool with FIDO2 is there's essentially, think of it as linkage of like you're never going to submit your credential, if you will, to a website that is not the actual legitimate one that is expected, right? So you're never going to send it to Microsoft with an extra I in the domain name or whatever it might be, right? And so it's I'd say much more tightly coupled, if you will, with the actual authentication and what you're actually logging into. And so um, the thing that kind of remains a challenge, though, is that there's certain applications, right, where they're embedding and displaying like the SSO prompt. Take something like I think even most recent versions of Microsoft Teams, but maybe they've fixed it. But they were using kind of an older embedded browser, wasn't working right. So you're essentially not able to do the FIDO2 device authentication, and you're having to make like an exception for that. I think something got fixed there. So again, I could be wrong, but there's different examples like that, or it could be some thick client, desktop application that also is doing wonky things with how it's doing, like that SSO type of prompt, which is commonly what you're going to have, your FIDO2 set up with like an Okta, Microsoft, ping, so forth.
Absolutely. Those MFA, phishing kits that we've seen the rising prevalence of, like Evil Proxy, Evil Engine X2, where they're geared up and, for a couple of $400-ish a month, you can spin up infrastructure that mimics the login page of a lot of common services that might use MFA and proxy that through. So then the attacker is benefiting and logging those systems and you're just being redirected off while they're sifting out information and grabbing things out of those accounts. So this is no longer the kind of sophisticated attacks. This is off-the-shelf software that you're able to do and start to send out. And then those phishing emails like you were talking about, Carl, where you end up on a very realistic looking landing page. You're seeing the MFA challenges, you're doing all these things, but then it's just being siphoned off. So that's really important to be aware of, I think, in this landscape.
I was just going to add, like, one of the things I've seen that's pretty interesting with some of the like very large enterprise companies, where there's a lot of in-house applications, and so it's one of the constant challenges for like infosec teams, where they're trying to make sure that all the internal applications that are getting developed are, properly using the company SSO, so on and so forth, because it tends to be, internal app, some department off somewhere. They're building, something custom, and just to get things done, they end up using local accounts, and so now it's these other accounts to this potentially critical system that you both don't know about as an infosec team, but you also aren't properly having things like SSO. So if an employee gets let go or leaves, that you're properly disabling their account kind of across the board, and so it's always one of those kind of visibility gaps that like ends up happening, right? Of like, where do I have those apps that are not kind of properly using our standards? And one of the things I've seen with some of the enterprises that I think tend to do it a little bit better is, you always have to think about like security engineering, right? Like in the same way that we think about, I'd say like an old school way of thinking of like, well, I'm just going to make sure my employees never click on a bad phishing link, and it's like that's like an extremely hard task, and it's a burden that like frankly you don't need to put on your users. Just there's technical solutions for it. And same thing when we think of like internal apps and like properly using SSO. One of the things I always like to ask security teams that are kind of running around doing this whack-a-mole of yelling at folks, why aren't you using it? It's like, well, what's like the SDK that you've like given them? What's like the base templates, right? What's that security engineering where you're like, here is our default, .NET Core or Python template to actually go set up, your new app. And again, stuff that's easier said than done, depending on resources and everything else. But it's kind of a different, maybe more in the weeds at some level, example of like, are you doing the sort of security engineering that is like making you more resilient versus, just kind of hoping and playing whack-a-mole as you find things. So.
Yeah. And on that kind of security engineering and architecture piece, one of the things that we've seen consistently in these big breach stories is, we've started off with an identity, we've managed to get past the MFA challenge, and then it's into a VPN, and then very bad things happen quickly. We're seeing rapid escalation of privileges, touching lots of systems. And sometimes these are, contractors or third parties. And in one case, we saw, a prominent vendor who was popped because someone had their credentials stored within their personal Google account, the Chrome password store for logging into web interfaces. So the attacker compromised a personal Gmail account, got some credentials, tricked the user into doing the MFA push notification thing, and then we see a rapid escalation. And to me, that's kind of, there's a flaw there in the architecture of how has this person got such permissive access and so many permissions that they could start and jump off and cause all that damage. So I don't know, Carl, have you got any thoughts around the way people architect their environments there?
Yeah, and I'd maybe add that I've probably said this even on the podcast before. Normally if I was recording at home, I have the old DoD rainbow books on my bookshelf, right? And when did those come out? Like late '80s, early '90s, kind of ish time frame. Yeah, something like that. And but what's interesting, and this is obviously going way back, but it talks about concepts like least privilege and stuff, and there's all these variations, and obviously there's the modern takes on zero trust, but everything kind of gets back to the heart of making sure people only have access to exactly what they need to, right? So there's so many different examples of it, right? There's so many companies that still have, broad, wide open VPN access, like I think you were mentioning, like, I might only need the VPN to get access to, a single system as a contractor. But when I VPN in, yeah, I might only have, the ability to authenticate to that one system, but I can still see the entirety of the network. I can still see everything kind of adjacent to that system. And so there's obviously a lot that companies are doing on how do you actually do that right sort of access that is giving you just access to what you actually need, right? And I mean that's just one area. There's obviously so many others as far as the not only how you kind of making sure people have only access what they have or what they need to, but also how you're just kind of limiting attack surface in general, right? Like um, the maybe as a side tangent, one of the things I always look at going into, if I was going to a new company to help them with security, is sometimes everybody's kind of jumping to the point of like, especially for a company that's been around a while, jumping to the point of like, well, how do I secure what's here? And one of the first things I always like to do is like, what can we prune that we like don't need, right? Because it could be that like, you have some legacy, sprawling Active Directory environment that like made sense at a point in time. But moving to like Azure AD and like other modern systems is like, the better route, right? Or you still running on-prem Exchange, right? Which you should burn down yesterday, for better or worse. And so sometimes it's just like, how are you removing those things in the first place? Which I realize is a little off topic from zero trust, but I think those two things are always intertwined in my brain of like, what are you doing to reduce your attack surface, constantly, and what are you doing to better tailor, people only having access to what they should, right? And there's so many different facets to both of those, though. What about you, James?
Yeah, I think it's very much down to that thing that Carl said of getting it working is easy, or to an extent can be easy. And the problem a lot of the time I always find is that security debt is silent debt. If you give everyone in your org local admin rights, you don't patch their systems, you give them access to everything, you're not going to get many help desk tickets for I can't access this system, I can't do this thing, I can't install this thing I need to for my job. But that attack surface is growing and growing and growing. So unless you have an idea of what the attack surface is, because when you get hit, then you get hit hard. And the thing I've seen in a lot of these big breach stories is we almost skip over this part of the story where it says, users' credentials were phished. They did this MFA trick and they managed to manipulate the user into pressing the button. Well, of course they did. They're not doing anything clever. They're doing what teenagers do. And a lot of these attackers, Lapsus Group and things, we see teenagers in the frame for it because they just nag you until they get the thing you want. So that gets you past the MFA challenge. But then we pretend like it's magic because it says the attacker was then able to elevate privileges and steal all these other credentials. Well, again, there's laws of physics that apply here. If any user in an org could dump domain admin credentials, then we'd be in a very bad place. This is because a user has been provisioned with privileges, a system has people logging into it, there's credentials they can dump there. There's probably a load of signals that you can look for from repeated MFA challenges, new MFA devices being added, unusual IP addresses, logging into the VPN, unusual patterns of access between different systems. There's so many things out there we could start to look for, but we sort of often in these write-ups, it's almost glossed over like, well, it was game over. The attacker had got some username and password, and then of course they were able to compromise the entire network. And that's the piece that's missing for me of people thinking about those. Forget about the latest AI and ML detection piece that you're thinking of. Those fundamentals of, do I control the devices? Do I control the software? Do I control the identities? Do I control the access? And then that kind of detection on the top of all that and building it so you don't undermine your investment. Because, you see again in those same news stories that the attacker ran a PowerShell script that disabled Windows Defender and local event logs. Well, yeah, that's because they've been able to use a privileged identity there on the Windows endpoint potentially to do that. Your standard user can't do that. So, it's a drum I've been banging for far too many years now. But I think that's the piece that people are often missing. These aren't magic. There is, like you said, there's physics involved in them, and it can go back to to Carl's birth and the DoD Rainbow books of those key concepts that are out there around only giving people access to what they need to do their job, and then monitoring for when they're trying to cross boundaries outside of that. Simple things like that can actually go a long, long way to making you more secure.
Yeah, and there's actually something interesting in what you just said. You just very rapidly, as you're explaining, there was a part you said of the progression, right? Of like from kind of like endpoint into identity, and like it's worth like dwelling or highlighting for a second of like, if you think of like the overall progression of the security space, there was you have all these systems being interconnected, and then there's the invention of the firewall of like, well, let's put the castle moat, right, around everything, and keep people from from the outside from getting in a general sense. And then everybody realized, there really is no kind of perimeter, and so everything became about how do I defend my endpoints, my end systems themselves. Both of these things are still, true, and still things people need to be practicing. But we very much have arrived at this kind of, third distinct area, I would say, and there's obviously smaller kind of subsets along the way, where it's not just about the my endpoints and my systems and how am I protecting them, but it's really about like the identities in general, right? And especially these days where like what it means to compromise your account, James, could be spread across multiple different devices, some company owned, some not, some laptops, some mobile, some who knows. And not to mention the proliferation of machine accounts where you have how much of your business that's being driven, not anything to do with any human identity, but just machine identity in terms of interconnectivity of systems. And so it's an interesting progression, and you were kind of touching on it, where one of the first things I think in any security domain that people look for is visibility, right? Like you're just trying to understand like what is the visibility into the problem space. And so when we think in terms of like identity and a lot of what we've been talking about right now, visibility is that like first part where it's in order to try to understand where should I be applying the principle of least privilege, where should I be improving certain aspects of what I might do from a zero trust perspective. You have to have the kind of visibility and even understanding and kind of knowing what you don't know about your environment. And obviously that's an interesting proposition when you think of your environment in terms of your environment's no longer just that perfect corporate network, right? It's expansive. It's remote workers, devices, third parties, SaaS, cloud. It's sprawling, right? The estate of what most companies are having to deal with these days, and so there's just something I think you mentioned the one to hone in for folks, because I think it's enormously important. It's a different mindset of kind of how you think about securing your environment. So.
Yeah, that's great. And if we're doing some tool shout outs as well, I've been looking at Azure Goat and AWS Goat. So I'm assuming Goat is in greatest of all time. So it's very much similar to Damn Vulnerable Web App and these kind of tools. So if you've ever come across them, they're great, training opportunities to spin up a vulnerable web server and then just learn a bit about security. And that's that education piece that we were talking about that was lacking earlier. And these are systems where you can spin up vulnerable AWS infrastructure, Azure infrastructure, just to be able to explore it and understand the threats that are out there, and then start to realize where some of these might be without necessarily having to go and start tearing into your production environment. You can run exercises with your own, SRE teams, engineering teams to start to look at, okay, if we configure these cloud environments in this way, what are our risks? Where do these risks lie, and how can we make sure we don't fall into these traps? Because, as you say, everything gets pushed out, and still the same problems. It's just now in the cloud, and people go, "Oh, it's an AWS. I don't necessarily understand it." So I think these are really good learning opportunities to go out there and get hands on and see what good practice looks like, what bad practice looks like, and be able to differentiate between the two. Yeah. Mark, any tools, any cool things that you've seen recently?
I don't know if I have a specific tool. I would shout out to somebody I follow on Twitter that I think is always highlighting a lot of good tools and resources out there. I apologize, I've never heard his last name out loud, so I'm gonna butcher it and then I'll spell it. But on Twitter, Clint Gibler, maybe Gibler. And I believe he tweets, it's literally just at Clint, ClintGibler. I think he's somebody that's fantastic to cover, that does a really great job of encapsulating a lot of the interesting tools that have been coming out, papers and tech docs and things that are like worth reading and so forth. So I would definitely check him out as somebody to follow. That's kind of, I think, always has a good stream of things like that to be learning about.
Excellent.
And now I've lost my co-host to looking them up.
So as we sort of start to wrap up the Halloween special, shall we turn towards the light a bit and say what good things have you seen in security of late? What things have impressed you?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting that the threat actors changing rapidly, starting to use like link files and ISO files to try and bury payloads in different ways to the malicious documents.
Didn't Microsoft, like, wasn't a few months ago, they initially said, hey, we're disabling macros, and then they were like, oh, maybe not, and then now they finally are saying yes, we actually are. Was there some like a back and forth, or am I remembering
they were going to do it, and then they held back on it, and then it wasn't by default. But the general trend is towards, if you pulled it down off the internet and it hasn't been created in your organization, why on earth are you going to let the macros run by default? Why are you going to let the user say, yeah, this is probably okay? Because most of the phishing emails out there literally are visually going to a user, hey, this is a secure doc. You should click enable macros to make it even more secure.
This is the thing that your life has been missing. Click here.
Exactly. But it's playing on that user's psychology of, I think I've been told that I should do security things. This says this is a security thing. So it's good to see Microsoft finally going, you know what, we're going to tackle this. We're going to start doing things around credential theft and Windows Defender credential guard, to separate out where the credentials are stored and stop them being dumped even by someone with administrator privileges on the endpoint. Some really good steps coming with Windows 11. Caveat being, it's going to be a long tail, and there's still going to be a lot of these things kicking around in systems and environments and enterprises, because
Yeah.
some people are still running XP. So, it's going to be a long, slow, drawn out death for these things. But direction of travel seems really good. Anything you want to call out, Mark?
Yeah. No, I think there's a ton. The I mean, I think one of the things that's always worth highlighting is like the infosec community at large is like a thriving, amazing one. I mean, I think you always have to be kind of maybe disciplined at some level of you know there's a level of exploring, and there's so much good content. There's so many things that you can learn, that at some point, I think it's worthwhile picking like an area to kind of go deep in, because you can easily stay surface level for a very long time, and there's nothing necessarily like wrong with that, right? It's just I think it's easy to kind of stay above the surface for a very long time because there's so much good content. There's every week there's more than you could ever read and learn, and tools that you could ever play with, and so forth. So, I think finding that focus area, you obviously have to do, especially if you're earlier in your career, you always got to do that level of exploration to kind of see what piques your interest, because I think ultimately, trying to settle on some aspect of infosec that is what you're going to be most passionate about. But I mean, I think the the thing I'm always extremely positive on is the just the community around information security, and like the amount of awesome tooling that's out there. The transfer of knowledge and everything else is something to be truly positive about. And I think also for some of the we were talking earlier about some of the kind of core physics or repeating problems of like the last 20 years. Like I think there's you know certain areas where we're just finally arriving at like better fundamentals, like better technology, that allows to kind of solve some of these problems in better ways, right? So when we think in terms of things like FIDO2, that we've mentioned a few times. When we think in terms of like when you want to do the sort of big data processing where there might have been ideas years ago, and it was like good luck trying to do that on prem, or not being part of some very large company. Like what's enabled of what you can kind of do with a even a free tier AWS account, as far as like learning and playing around with these things, is like pretty amazing. So I think there's a level of while there have been variety of kind of those repeating concepts and messages, there is a point of acceptance around like the technology existing, and also like a will to do some more of these things. And so yeah, I think there's without a doubt still plenty of things to be solved for, but um, we're in a much better place, and I think sometimes it's hard to see that if you haven't been kind of in it long enough to have like that perspective, right? Doesn't mean the problems are all solved, and there's plenty of new ones that are being created, and we'll see plenty of interesting things in the future around machine learning issues and so on and so forth. But definitely, without a doubt, progress, right? And I think everybody always wants the that like perfect kind of finish line to progress, and there isn't that for security, right? It's just moving forward and hopefully making things better and leaving them better than you found them, right? So, what about for you, James?
I think there's a lot of positive energy and movement around security at the moment. The thing that I mentioned around the Windows operating system, it's getting more secure by default. We've seen the macros thing. We've seen a lot of the core operating system things being abstracted into hypervisors and degree of separation there. And if you actually look at the vulnerability landscape, we're seeing far fewer of those big bang. You need this one exploit to run code in the kernel. It's actually, now I need this series of 10 different little exploits to break out of the Chrome sandbox to then run code on a standard user to then try and, so there's more staging to it. And actually, the more steps you can put in an attack chain, the noisier the attacker has to be, and the more likely you are to detect them. So I think that general direction is a real positive for me. The amount of interest and funding and opportunities in the industry, and the kind of, I think we're seeing a bit more of a rise of the infosec storyteller, which is something I always think has been missing for a long time, of being able to communicate issues into the business and the business listening. You're not just the gatekeeper in the basement anymore with the blinking lights and the servers. You are, someone who's part of the business decision-making process, and risk and understanding the cyber landscape is part of the standard business process now, which I think is a really positive step in the right direction there. Plenty of work to be done, plenty of improvements, constantly shifting landscape. But if we can get those fundamentals right and get people bought in and understanding the problems, then I think, we're in a good place to move forward.
Definitely, dude.
Okay, well, as it's the Halloween special, we've got to end on a scary note. So I'm going to ask you, what are you still scared of? This could be spiders or something in your personal life, or it could be something in cyber. It's up to you. Recording podcasts, okay?
I mean, you don't show it, Carl. I'll say that, buddy.
Okay, yeah, I'd agree with that one, actually. I think to Mark's point and your point earlier around like the amount of volume and, go deep on certain areas, because you could drown in InfoSec Twitter, you could combine that with imposter syndrome and all the things going on in the news. And, your full-time job could just be looking at Twitter, right? Sometimes you got to pick what you want to focus on and do things, because it can just be overwhelming, the amount of noise that's out there around these things.
Yeah, no, without a doubt. And there's always that sense of like, you're feeling like, are you missing out because you're not learning this or getting this other knowledge here or there? But like, I think that's like one of the signs you can know if you're on the right path is like, can you point to all the things that you kind of at some level decided you weren't going to go search out and everything else, right? Because you're so focused on something. And I think I'm always. I think earlier in my career was always like, what's the technological thing? That's always like the worry and stuff. And I think these days the important part that I always try to think about, like personally and like professionally, is like I think where things really get off the rails. And what always worries me most is just if you have too much cynicism or like complacency that like creeps in, right? And I think that's those are two of the bigger killers for making any sort of progress, whether individually or as a team, right? And it's I think in our industry and where it is this kind of race that doesn't have a finish line, it's easy for those things to kind of creep in, and especially if you've been doing it long enough, right? Because you see some level of what's repeating and the same mistakes happening and so on and so forth, right? So I think keeping those things in check. That doesn't mean put your head in the sand, right? But I think keeping those things in check is always an important thing. So.
Yeah, that's great. And I think the personal one for me would be the overwhelming information thing, but more broadly on a professional level, I think the thing I'm still scared of is the culture where people will blame the end user. The thing we talked about earlier, where
I love that
they've opened the phishing email, they're an idiot, they have
Yeah.
exposed us to risk, they've fallen for the MFA thing, they are dangerous, they have exposed us to risk. And actually, the mechanisms you've put around that user, the permissions you've given them, the access you've given them, is the thing that has exposed your business to risk. You should accept that a user is going to potentially have their password
100%.
breached on the dark web. They're going to store it in a Gmail account. Your job is to limit the blast radius of that and put in the controls that mean that, you're not giving them the loaded gun there. You're giving them just the tools they need to be able to do their job.
Yeah, I think that like blame the user mentality is probably one of the just dumbest takes in security. So I wholeheartedly agree with you, James. It's like it's by no means an easy feat. Everything that you got to kind of do as an infosec team, and it doesn't mean that a level of education isn't helpful. On when people should speak up and so forth, right? But the thinking the problem is the users is crazy talk. So yeah, I very much agree with you, man.
Cool. Anything anyone else wants to cover before we wrap this up?
I mean, I gotta ask the important security question, dude. The Halloween, dude. What's your guys' favorite candy? Yeah, and I just realized I might not actually know what your guys' favorite candy even means because you guys are gonna be coming from
Yeah, what's
the across the
candy?
pond.
You mean
So
sweets?
yeah, what yeah, sweets? Is that what you candy bars? What do you guys call it? A sweet bar? Well, what if it's not chocolate though? You guys you're like, okay. So wait, what's your favorite sweets then? What's your favorite Halloween sweets? Are those like the little gummy things? Okay. All right. All right. Solid. Oh, okay. I don't even know. I don't even know what that is. Oh, just like the regular gummy berry. Oh, it's a type of gummy berry. Okay. Okay. I'm gonna have to look this up. All right, James. What do you got for sweets? Sweet bars or whatever you guys call them.
I don't have a Halloween specific one, although I think for anyone who's ever read the reviews of sugar-free Haribo bears on Amazon and the laxative effects they have, I think they sound like a terrifying candy to eat. There's
So
some
you don't
fantastic
do
reviews
those
on
with a
Amazon if
coffee
you haven't
chaser
seen
in
that.
this morning, is what I'm hearing.
Personally, yeah, we tend to do like around this time of year a bit of bonfire toffee maybe, or some like warming aniseed balls. Or the thing I do like in terms of American candy, you guys have loads of cinnamon things and red hots and hot tamales and all this kind of thing that I absolutely love, and we just
There
don't
you
get
go.
over here.
Those are
Anything
solid.
that's warming in a winter's day.
You guys will have to search out if you haven't had a Fifth Avenue candy bar. That is the jam. Fifth Avenue. By the way, we should probably in the intro make sure to call out that how there's you always got to say to the listener, stay to the end because the most exciting bits at the end. We need you to hear the whole thing. Clearly,
clickbait.
everybody who stayed till now to listen to us talk about our favorite candy, you're winning. You're winning. Whoa. Might be meeting our ex co-host here, insulting the Fifth Avenue like that. It's like it's I don't know how to put it, more chocolatey and less
Awful.
feels like it's gonna stick and tear your teeth off. Yeah, yeah, that's my scientific take on it. Yeah, exactly. There you go. There you go. Awesome. Well, definitely happy Halloween to you guys. I could probably keep going and ask you like what you're dressing up as. Mine's an easy answer. It's a Where's Waldo costume because it's literally a hat and a shirt. And it's the same one I've done for like 10 years. It's very inspiring. Dang it. Or I could go old school hacker Mayfrey costume. I think is what James is holding up there in the camera.
That's what I'm going as. I Googled what does a teen hacker look like, so I'm going to go dressed like that.
No. All right. With that, we're going to get signed off. Thank you guys. I had a lot of fun.
Thanks to Carl and Mark. And thanks to our super producer, Jesse, and Sarah, who wrangles this podcast and makes it possible.